What's the cost of your own slavery? Cities of the world wide web take to the streets. The best sleight of hand we've ever seen. We sleep to be taught and we're taught by their dreams. Oh. No,
Good evening and welcome to the Live Register. This evening we look at the issue of social housing and ask why this problem has never been properly addressed.
The southwest inner city is an area which has seen generations of deprivation and neglect by the state and local authorities. After years of campaigning by communities affected, there has been an attempt to implement regeneration projects, some of which have been successful and others less so.
First up, we spoke to Cecilia from Community Action Network about a project they've been involved in Dolphin House.
Cllr was set up 25 years ago to tackle inequalities and to try and build a more just and equal society. And from the very beginning, one of the areas that we have been involved with has been to do with housing. Through those years, we have been involved, say, at the very beginning with facilitating the Ballymun Task Force, and then right through the years, right through the Celtic Tiger time, all of that, we've been involved in housing-related issues in many of the flats complexes in Dublin, in Portlaoise, in Limerick and in other parts of the country. The issues that we have been dealing with have mostly to do with very substandard housing. We have seen incredible dampness, people live with sewerage that comes up their baths or sinks, they live with faulty structures, overcrowding, lack of play facilities and generally run-down estates and antisocial behaviour.
My name is Debbie Mulhall. I'm a resident here at Dolphin House, but I was actually born and reared in Dolphin House and I've been living here now for the last 20 years. In 1970 my own parents got their own flat because they'd had a set of twins at that stage, so they got their own flat. The flat that they moved into was really bad with sewage and for instance, I remember my father having to clean up raw sewage. I'll be nice and polite about it. That had come up over the toilet and had gone all down the halls. So he had to take off the bedding off the beds to actually wipe it up. And I thought we were special because we had mushrooms growing in our bathroom. And they weren't magic mushrooms, they were just mould, and we also had snails, and that was just part parcel. Now, my parents are deceased now, and the person that lives in that flat today, and this is like 40 years later, is still having the same problems that was there 40 years ago.
In every occasion, people live with that very much as an individual, and as individuals, their experience of that is always surrounded by shame, sense of inadequacy, a sense of failure. That's compounded by the fact that individuals are continuously told it's to do with the way they're living, they're not washing their walls right, or they're not opening their windows, or there's something that they're doing that's wrong.
A lot of people were actually embarrassed by it. It wasn't their fault, but when you go into some people's homes, you got a nasty smell. So therefore, you kind of say, I don't want to invite people into my home because you felt it was yours. And it wasn't your fault, but people actually felt that it was their fault that these smells were in their homes. So people kind of went, I don't want to invite people in. So, I mean, obviously if that happens, it's embarrassing. So I believe it has a big impact on mental health as well.
By the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, I suppose we were beginning to really know about inequality, but know about it in a very different way. Like everyone, we knew that it had related to structures and how we organise ourselves in society, but I think by the end of the Celtic Tiger, we really knew that it had to do with the values we place on every individual and how everyone, the kind of society that we want to live in. We started to explore different approaches, and that brought us into the human rights-based approach. For us, I suppose we knew nothing, we're a community development organisation, we knew nothing about human rights. Human rights, I suppose, was very much something that belonged out there. But what we learned was, in a very simple way, that we all have human rights. We have a right to adequate housing. The Rialto Rights in Action project is an area where we've been very involved, where we get people to tell about their lived experience, and in this case they have lived with dampness and sewerage for years. They've been told it's their problem for many a year. So in a very systematic, disciplined way, we broke down the whole notion of the right to housing and connected it to the lived experience of people and gave them the language and the thinking of rights.
What we would have said when we started learning about human rights first was that we would have went to, say, the estate management and asked them to fix stuff for us, whereas in actual fact, they're not the people who should have been going to. And we learned then that it's actually the Department of Housing, the Department of the Environment and the Department of Health. So we used to call that black box stuff, and we stay out of the black box now. So we go further up the ladder, because they're the people in power and they're the ones that can help us with the problems.
It totally transformed their experience because it suddenly means that the emphasis is no longer on them. It's on the systems that have failed to address those issues. So that whole shift from need to accountability has been dramatic.
I love the human rights stuff. I just think it's very empowering, and I think they're listening to us now, because things are, starting to get put on the agenda. So I think the human rights stuff has made them, sit up and listen. So now they sit at the table with us and we can talk about it openly, so it's a good thing. We have moved on. I
have worked in housing for years, and I've worked in areas, go in and out of all sorts of areas where people live with a lot of inequality for many, many years. And in the last couple of years, I have been horrified, absolutely horrified by the conditions that people are really living in. A lot of people don't show you those conditions. Because it's so connected to identity and self-esteem, it's because of all those things that Lorna Fox O'Mahony talks about. So I can go out publicly and tell you about, yes, I have dampness or sewage coming up my house. It's a very different thing inviting me into your home and showing me what you have to live with. You cannot underestimate the impact of that on a person's life and their own self-esteem. And when you have local authorities, like I have seen this, people are going into those flats and houses every single day of the week from local authorities. They see it, but somehow they don't see it. Somehow, I don't know what has happened to us. What has happened to us as a society that we do not see these things? So when I can produce photographs now of sewerage in a bath, we'll all be horrified. We feel the shame. I feel ashamed that I have lived in a society and continue to live in a society that allows so many people to live with those conditions and to feel responsible for them when it's not their responsibility. I feel ashamed that we have lived in a society where we talk about home as a commodity to be bought and sold and to make profit on.
So we're joined in the studio now by Conor McCabe, the author of Sins of the Father, tracing the decisions that shaped the Irish economy. Conor, you're very welcome.
Thanks,
one of the issues you deal with in the book is housing, of course, and shaping or going back and looking at different housing policies since the foundation of the state. So how do you think the current situation with regard to social housing relates back to, say, the situations since in the past?
Well, I mean, there is roughly as many social housing units in Ireland today as there was 40 years ago. The difference being is that it is almost double the amount of households. So the change has been that Ireland doesn't produce net social housing anymore. It tries to just maintain
its current stock. It hasn't really expanded on the numbers.
Not really, no. I mean, not since the 1980s, you know. And the thing about kind of social housing is that it's a newish phrase. That I'm a historian, so new was in like 20 years. But I mean, it's a newish phrase. This idea of kind of social housing. And affordable housing, which is a great phrase, affordable housing, because it kind of implies that the last thing that should ever be affordable is your house. You know, it's a weird phrase. If you're going to have an owner-occupier, kind of society, you need jobs that can pay for it. And we don't, and that's why credit was brought in. That's the problem. If you're going to have people owning houses, then houses have to be worth, or prices have to be on average, national average, around 2.5 times the median wage. That's we're not even close to that now.
Well, I mean, like in the last few years, well, not in the last few years, but prior to the last few years, we saw a huge expansion, the bubble obviously, in terms of housing prices. So why was that allowed to happen?
Because people make money from selling credit. How you make money is by selling credit, and if you sell credit to people who have problems paying it back, they're your best customers because you charge them more on the interest. So in credit, if you're selling debt, the best customers for you are those who are least capable of paying it, because because then you charge them more.
Yesterday we spoke with community activists about their experience with regeneration.
They also told us their perspective on public-private partnerships.
The Fallon Mansion is a large local authority flat complex. It was built in the 1950s as a response to the slum housing that was in around the Dublin city area, and many people came here to live here. Would have moved into that first kind of flat with their own bathroom and such. And relatively speaking, for the first 20-30 years of its existence, it was a very kind of happy place to be for people who lived here. In the 1980s, with the recession and the emerging heroin problem, Fallon became a very problematic area, and as a result of that, the refurbishment program took place. That refurbishment program cost £6.5 million at the time, and in some ways, you know, it would be the region of 50 million today, I'd imagine. So there was a lot of investment put in. But the investment that was put into Fallon in the mid-1980s was essentially physical investments. I suppose around 1995, when the community had enough, had decided that something else needed to be done. You know, there was a lot of frustration, there was a lot of anger, particularly in regards to the investments that had gone into the area the previous 15 years. So as a community and as a community project, we set about trying to fix that. So throughout the next couple of years, the project got on with the demolition and preparing for the residents moving into temporary accommodations and such. And then in 2003, the community learned that there would be a public-private partnership. To a large extent, what you have in Fallon today is a result of the physical plan that was agreed, and the social plan, and the economic plan. Now, you know, in 2009, with the collapse of the economy, particularly in relation to the housing sector, we somehow managed to see the project through, particularly in relation to the physical and the social commitments that were given in relation to dealing with the needs within this community. But unfortunately, most areas across the city now and across the country, we've seen significant public cuts.
This estate here in St Michael's Estate has been waiting 14 years to have a sod turned. We were let down 3 times over by different plans and different models, like the model for public-private partnership, which fell through at Bernard McNamara. At the moment there's 76 units being built on it. We worked towards a plan, and that plan was over 2 years, and we worked with the councillors, we worked with the community, we worked with the officials of Dublin City Council and architects, and we built this plan that was, I think, for 380 units. We were that near, and what happened was the government changed their policy once again, and they got this idea of public-private partnership. So they rejected our plan, and they said you have to have a public-private partnership. And then they closed the doors on our face, and they said, no, you won't be part of this planning piece. And at that stage, the community of St Michael's Estate was literally on its knees, because we were had to put in so much work, and we did it together. And at this stage, we went into a deep state of shock. We set up a campaign. We collected 3,000 signatures throughout the whole of Cllr, calling for to save our plan. We wrapped them up in a box of nicely coloured paper, and we went into the city manager's office. That was John Fitzgerald at the time. We handed them in there. We went down outside City Council where they wanted to unfold their plan. There was something like 820 units was going to be built on St Michael's Estate. in the form of 8 to 10 towers, and there were people who were calling for the towers to be pulled down. And in that, there was only something like 70 local authorities there would have been. The rest of them were for sale.
In a simple way, the quid pro quo of PPP in places like St Michael's Estate and O'Devany Gardens was that the state effectively said to the developer, here's 12 or 14 acres of land, we want you to build ABC for us and you can have the rest and you can do whatever you like on it. So if you take St Michael's Estate, 14 acres, the preferred bidder was McNamara Castlethorne, so the state said to them, which was driven a lot by the negotiations that residents and community groups had done, we want X numbers of public housing, we want these facilities, and then you can build whatever. So the developer looked at that, and the way they looked at those sites was that to amass as many private housing units as possible and retail facilities in their spaces, and to sell them for as much as they could within the planning regulations, right? And I think they had a bottom line of around 15%, but the idea was that there would be, potentially there would be an uplift, that would increase for them.
During the Celtic Tiger, I think the state became very clever. What I believe they did was they set their eyes on rich land that poor people lived on. St Michael's Estate is 14 acres. It's beside a Museum of Modern Art, it's beside a Memorial Park, it has a Lewis Lion. It's a fantastic piece of land for the rich to live on. O'Devany Gardens was right beside Phoenix Park, beautiful piece of land. Dolphin House was along the canal. So there, you know, where Charlemont Street, just along the canal. So when you look at the pieces of land that the state set for regeneration, it wasn't about the care of the poor. It was actually about, you know, robbing the land of the people. Nobody questioned the idea that is it mad to base public policy on an idea of how much a house will be sold for, right? That purely kind of arbitrary, fluctuating idea of house prices. So all of those projects were tied in to the market from day one as PPPs in relation to whether house prices were up or down, and that was the fundamental premise of the housing PPPs in Dublin, and the one that was supposed to happen in Limerick as well. So in around late 2007, early 2008, when house prices collapsed in Ireland, like the same developer, McNamara, had 5 PPPs in Dublin, 3 of them old flat complexes and 2 of them on other sites. Said there's not enough, literally in his press release said there's not enough money in it anymore, right? So the only public-private partnership to go ahead was the Fatima Mansions project, and all of the others that were listed to go on the conveyor belt, if you like, collapsed instantaneously. They all collapsed, right?
It's common sense. It really is common sense. When you ask people, what do you think will make a regeneration project work? Everybody says, oh, it has to be a good physical design with good participation from those who will be living in communities. It has to have a good social plan which deals with the social needs, and it has to have a good economic plan which deals with the future. Everyone says that, but the reality is, when it gets down to the actual doing of it, what tends to happen is the Department of Environment tends to say, we're responsible just for the physical. In our case here, it was both the developer and government departments. The problem now is there's no money within the country. So when people say, well, we're not responsible, and yet we're still building, it does not make sense.
States usually say they have no money, right, to provide whatever facilities they, you know, whether it's road infrastructure, usually these large scale projects, so that they say we need the private sector to help us to do this. But like even a simple fact that the state can borrow money at far lower interest rates and provide the facilities in that way is never even spoken about. It's not talked about. So it's much cheaper for states normally to borrow money than it is to pay back the private sector.
Just to bring it back to the social housing issue again, what are the main problems you see associated with that today?
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to the idea of what is housing. I mean, all housing should be social. We can't have a private housing like society. We just don't have the wage income for it, and we never will. That's not. There's never been a modern economy that kind of that can have 70 to 80% home ownership, because the jobs just aren't there for it. I mean, this is like, I mean, people buying houses with the wages which we have is a bit like people, instead of buying an airline ticket, they buy a jet.
But hasn't Ireland always had a sort of a history or a tradition of home ownership?
No.
No?
No.
Well, why is that such a common perception in society?
Because again, it's one of the reasons is ideological. The church wanted to make people owner occupiers because he would make them conservative, and he saw home ownership as a bulwark against communism. But in the 1940s, you have the Bishop of Cork at the time saying Irish people just don't understand that they need to own their own houses, and they're just not doing it. I mean, in 1946, the 1946 census is the first census where we have a clear indication of owner occupancy.
Yeah.
And outside of the Land Act areas, which is kind of rural areas, in homes, because like there's a difference between homes and farms.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There's a huge difference, between homes and farms. You try raising cattle in a home, it's just not going to. You know what I mean? It's completely different dynamic in terms of urban housing. In 1946, I think in Cork, it was around 25% maybe home ownership.
Really, that low?
Yeah. In Waterford, it was 13%. In Dublin, in the urban city now, and the city was in between the two kind of canals, I think it was around 37%.
I'm joined by Dermot Lacey, who's the chair of the Housing, Social and Community Affairs Strategic Policy Committee. You've actually said back in 2008, in relation to the public-private partnership, that is, in your opinion, not a very good way, as opposed to the state-funded social housing. Do you think there's a better approach?
I'm always in favour of trying anything. However, the bottom line is I want to see more housing units. And for the
do we need more housing units?
Yes,
Dublin.
Contrary to this image of there have been lots and lots of housing units, Dublin in fact has a chronic housing crisis. There are a number of apartments that are empty, invariably ones that aren't suitable for families, or in areas where it would not necessarily be good to put more families, particularly low families who have low income supports, or maybe some of them have social needs. A social mix is what keeps real communities together. But in the sheer numbers, there's about 9,000 families on the Dublin housing list. Now, we're not going to resolve that by sort of, the odd NAMA building here and there. We have to revert to direct housing provision by the local authorities. I grew up in the Dublin Corporation House. In 1912, the then Pembroke Urban District Council had the foresight to build a house that my parents then ended up living in. I now live in a house that Dublin Corporation in the 1950s provided for the community then. The reality is we need more housing units, and we need the state to build them. And I will look favourably at all sorts of other options, renting properties, using NAMA-based properties, anything at all, because the bottom line is we want people to live in housing, but we need more units.
Do you not think the focus on rented accommodation or private rental accommodation is a problem? Do you not think that the state itself should actually provide the social housing?
Yes, I do, but at the same time, I think some of the new rental schemes are reasonably viable in that they give people a certainty. If you're a 25-year-old couple or a woman on her own with a child, you want to be able to ensure that that child can go to the national school down the road, and you're not going to be moved into a totally different area in 4 or 5 years' time. That degree of certainty is important, and that is now more and more possible within the government rental schemes. But the Bottom line, I come back to is we need more units.
Okay.
And part of my task is to try and identify sites, to identify partnerships that don't necessarily have to be of the public-private partnership model. If you take Dublin has about, I think the last time I saw, about 120 religious parishes.
Okay.
Just to use for areas of the geographic description. Each of those parishes has an acre or so of land in it that can be found for community development. You know, if we could encourage more and more housing cooperatives, local community initiatives, that at least begins the process. And if you say to me, well, why don't you do that? I have done that. In my own area, we built 24 housing units there. People are now living in them. All of the people who live in them came from flats that were in the area. So, you know, 48 families now have a home because of a very small initiative that a local community took. That is possible all across the city, but the state needs to make it easier for people. The Department of the Environment needs to be an enabler of such. We need to cut the red tape, we need to cut the bureaucracy, we need to simplify the schemes, and that is possible. It is possible to solve this problem.
One of the simple problems at the moment is we've, I don't know, at least 300,000 empty housing units in this country. And nationally we have close to 100,000 people on the waiting list who can't access that housing. So it's ludicrous that we should be in that situation. I think at the last count, only a handful of the housing units that NAM has said they would bring into the public domain have come into the public domain for all sorts of reasons. So we don't have a housing shortage. We've loads of houses, right? But the problem is we don't have the political will and the political nous to actually deliver on that when the need is growing.
What people need to realise is that people don't live here cheaply. You know what I mean? The rent is based on what people are earning. And although there may not be a high percentage of earners, you know, in Dolphin House, I mean, rents vary from maybe €40 up to 140 or maybe higher. It would depend on, so I mean, you have that and the privilege of living here, you know, and you kind of go like, it's not because the rents are high enough. So I think that those that's in the power, and they're the ones that should be assisting you because you're paying for it. They're the ones that's always been like, oh, we'll try our best. But again, that was black box stuff. So now we actually go to people that's further up the line, and stuff is getting done for us.
Every time you will meet somebody who lives in local authority housing, they will be at pains to tell you how much rent they're paying, because they're not getting it for nothing. They're not getting it for nothing at all. In fact, many of them are paying more rent than they would now in private housing. But they are paying it so that they remain part of communities that they've grown up with and that are strong, vibrant communities in loads of other ways. And for them, that's really important. But they would be at pains to tell you how much rent they're paying, simply because in society we don't believe that. We don't even think that they are.
Not everybody can afford housing on the market. Like that very simple fact, that's the essence of why people need public housing. People can't afford the market. And certainly in recent years people couldn't afford the market. So just that idea that we as a society that we would take it as upon ourselves to provide housing for people who can't afford housing in the private sector, right? That I think is an ethos that we should have, and that we should do it really well.
Thinking of housing as assets has failed to resolve the social housing problem in Ireland. Social housing has never been prioritised by the government, not even during the boom.
I think the idea of bringing in the human rights angle that some of the groups are bringing in is very interesting, and it seems to be making a bit of a difference anyway. Some of the groups that we spoke to earlier gave us a lend of this poster here, and it's advertising a march coming up on the 24th, which is this Saturday, and it's a general anti-austerity march. So if you have time, it would be great to see you there.
What's the cost of your own slavery? Cities of the world wide whipped it.